Good evening. My name is Cheryl Nunez. I'm the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at Olympic College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the college's second Presidential Equity and Excellence Lecture. Thank you. The series of which it is a part reflects the recognition that excellence in educating our students and in serving and enriching our community is only achievable through the eradication of gaps based on race, class, gender, and other social categories. This is transformative work in which the community must share. We are, after all, accountable to your interest and to your demands. And therefore, we are gratified by your presence here tonight. We're very fortunate to welcome a scholar activist who has dedicated her life to equity and excellence. As an historian, Barbara Ransby has studied and written about power, with an emphasis on the power that inheres in people acting collectively to transform unjust structures. As an activist, she's been at the center of the movements she's studied, movements connected through a shared belief in the possibilities of radical human agency. Because this is a presidential lecture series, I will now leave it to Olympic College President David Mitchell to introduce our esteemed speaker.
Thank you, Cheryl. It may be a presidential lecture series, but Cheryl Nunez is putting all this together, and she's done an outstanding job. It was her idea. I was very supportive and pleased, and the encouragement and the hard work she's put into putting these lecture series together has just been incredible, and it's been a great service to the community. I've heard nothing but positive feedback from members of our community, and so I'd like us to recognize Cheryl Nunez for her excellent work.
And all the Olympic College staff who stand with me, I have to say, who are here tonight, thank you all.
Yes. Dr. Barbara Ransby is visiting us from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she is a distinguished professor of African American Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History. She is an author of Islandia, The Large Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson, 2013, and highly acclaimed Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision, 2003, both of which are available for purchase in the lobby. She has another book, Why All Black Lives Matter, due out this summer. She serves on the editorial board of the London-based journal Race and Class and the Scholars Advisory Committee of Ms. Magazine, and is editor-in-chief of Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. Among her many activist endeavors, she is one of the initiators of the 1991 African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, a co-convener of the Black Radical Congress, and the founder of Ella's Daughters, a network of women working in the tradition of Ellen Baker. It's abundantly clear that both her scholarship, activism, and her activism inform her deep and abiding faith in democratic possibilities of education. To speak now on democratizing knowledge, teaching and learning for critical citizenship, please join me in giving a warm Kitsap and Mason County community welcome to Professor Barbara Ransby.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you all for coming out. What a lovely theater. I have spoken in many different places and many different venues, and I don't think I've ever spoken in a theater with mermaids on the wall. So this is a first, and it's lovely. I want to thank Cheryl Nunez for inviting me to be with you tonight. I did not know her before she extended the invitation, but I now feel like we are colleagues and friends. She shared with me a mutual friend, Ann Braden, and her memories of Ann Braden, and I think we really bonded in the recollection and the shared admiration for Ann Braden. So that is definitely a benefit of having received this invitation. And I want to thank President David Mitchell for his kind introduction and for what I have now learned of his leadership of Olympic College. So I come to you tonight as a scholar activist who has really consciously spent my career cultivating an ambivalence about my role in the academy and the privileges that we enjoy. I also come to you in urgent times. I come to you in times that Dr. King would refer to as the fierce urgency of now. If higher education was not in crisis before this current moment, we are indeed in crisis now. Many of our students are vulnerable, undocumented students, Arab and Muslim students, and we have to ask the question if our colleges and universities are going to be the kind of sanctuary spaces that we want them to be, and if we are going to live up to the ideals of true diversity that so many of our institutions have espoused. I tell you, when I think of and listen to the words of our new Secretary of Education, I am deeply, deeply concerned. But a crisis can also be an opportunity to rethink what we do and how we do it, and to really ask ourselves some hard questions as educators about what is our mission. So I want to do a couple of things this evening. I want to talk about the crisis of American education and the challenges and opportunities that we face as educators, administrators, parents, and students. And at the same time, I want to situate the conversation in a larger conversation about civil rights, human rights, and social justice. In other words, I want to talk about the fight to democratize education and the fight to situate education within the larger democratic fight for racial and social justice. Since it is Black History Month and I am a historian of the African American experience, let me begin with a little bit of history. And I'll start with Reconstruction, but don't worry, I'm not going to go decade by decade, so, you know. Reconstruction was that dynamic period in the wake of the Civil War, the period that W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as the 10-year experiment with radical racial democracy. It tells us a lot about the struggle for education in this country. Now, freedom is defined in many ways by many people, and it means something different in each historical moment. For Black freed people in the wake of the Civil War, freedom meant liberty, land, and literacy. So during the difficult years in the aftermath of the bloodiest war in U.S. history, Black former slaves fought for the right to education. Schools were set up all over the South by the Freedmen's Bureau, and an important caveat to that is that African American freed people, with the small resources that they had, contributed to the building of their schools. It was just that important. So that establishes an intimate nexus between freedom and education in that profound crucible moment of the 1860s. Former enslaved people were figuring out a lot of things in that moment, including their relationship to the new regimes of power. But one thing they knew for sure, that education was an important currency in purchasing their freedom. There was no doubt about it. It was important for legal documents that they had to read and decipher. It was important for political argument. And it was important in terms of skills and technical knowledge in the increasingly industrialized labor force of the 19th century. But it was also important in social relations and in civic discourse. It was important in defining who they were as a people. Now, I want to say parenthetically that a part of the story that's not often told is that the campaign for education not only benefited former slaves, but benefited poor whites as well. The first time a public school system was set up throughout the South in this country in the wake of the Civil War, it was set up as a result of the demands and the longings of former slaves, but it benefited everyone. And the reason I tell this story is that so often we see anti-racist struggles and racial justice struggles as a zero-sum game. That the demands and victories of Black freedom struggles then are often criticized as transactions in narrow self-interest. Self-interest that detracts from the rights and resources of other groups. Well, this offers one example, and there are many others, of precisely the opposite. Now let me bring the democratic struggle for education into the 20th century. Education was as important in the second Reconstruction, the civil rights movement of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, as it was in the first. From the struggle for the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case in 1954, to the intense struggle to desegregate Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas in 1957, to the citizenship schools established by Septima Clark and others in the backwoods and cities throughout the South, South Carolina most notably in the 1950s, and the freedom schools set up by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi and other places in the 1960s. So when we talk about the fight for the soul of our educational system, we are not talking about a small side issue or a minority concern. We're talking about an issue that was at the epicenter of struggles for justice in this country and throughout the world. But educational institutions have not been and continue to be challenged by this democratic ideal. They are not always inclusive institutions in terms of who they teach, in terms of what they teach, or what they represent in the world. And I think there are three sets of questions that I want to hold up in our conversation tonight that confront those of us who are educators in terms of the challenge of democratizing education and knowledge. One very fundamental question is the question of access. Who gets in? Who gets an education? Even when institutions have open admissions, there are other hurdles in terms of who can stay and finish, right, without going bankrupt. Now, what is the tally of the student debt in this country? When you think of the amount of money that people owe in student loans in this country, does anybody want to proffer a guess at what it is? $1.2 trillion. That's a huge amount of money. I hope you're organizing around that, because if you know that figure, there's a campaign now around forgiving the student debt, but that's another barrier, right? So even when there are not traditional barriers to inclusion, money becomes that barrier, and it's a traditional barrier as well. It's a national disgrace, really. If there's anything our government should subsidize, it's the education of our children. And yet the cost of tuition continues to rise, and the public resources for education continue to diminish. The second challenge we face is also fundamental, and that's the challenge to rethink and reconsider and recalibrate how we see curriculum and even epistemology. Our theories of knowledge, how we know what we know. Increasingly, our curricula are dangerously pragmatic and utilitarian, and our epistemologies elitist and exclusive, and I'll say more about this. Finally, our institutional culture and citizenship in the larger community and world, our moral compass as educators needs to be recalibrated. Now let me say a little bit more about access. If we ask the question, who has a right to an education? My answer is everyone. But the response is often, but is everyone really qualified? I'm reminded of Lonnie Guinier's 2015 book, Tyranny of the Meritocracy. Lonnie Guinier is a Harvard law professor and activist, and she argues that we really need to radically rethink terms like merit, talent, and even intelligence. We participate in the fiction, she argues, that the difference between a 30 and a 28 on an ACT test is actually the difference between smart and not smart enough. Guinier talks about what she calls our testocratic culture, fixated on measurement as if it equals fairness and without questioning what qualities we are actually measuring. Guinier does not want to destroy the concept of merit, but to radically redefine it. To go beyond student performance and standardized tests, she juxtaposes the notion of a testocratic merit with the idea of a democratic merit. Democratic merit, for Lani Guinier, goes far beyond test scores to look at the skills and commitments that student applicants have and that democratic regimes require. Invoking Harvard economist Amartya Sen, Guinier writes that merit is an incentive system that rewards the actions a society values. Might we imagine, for example, a system of democratic merit that recognizes and rewards critical thinking, compassion, cooperation over competition, deliberate actions versus fast-paced performance? In other words, we set up unnecessary barriers to educational access, arbitrarily dividing students and would-be students into the qualified and the unqualified, the deserving and the undeserving, all the while convincing ourselves that these are objective and fair standards. The second critical issue that we need to tackle as we aspire to be truly democratic institutions, again, is this question of epistemology. How do we know what we know? In college and university settings, we justify having a claim to the corner on the market of knowledge production. We validate knowledge. We screen who gets to partake in scholarly life and learning. We establish metrics by which to determine the insiders and the outsiders, and then we rank not only people, but institutions. Fundamentally, we position ourselves in the whole complex of knowledge production as the ultimate arbiters of truth. Now, far be it from me in the current context to suggest in this post-truth era, with the dangerous resurgence of anti-intellectualism and know-nothingism, that evidence-based knowledge does not matter. I am not and would not say that, but here's what I would say. There are many more reservoirs of knowledge, many other ways of knowing that transcend colleges and universities. I have also learned this from colleagues in the field of disability studies. People who are hearing impaired develop acute senses of smell, taste, and sight, noticing things that others miss. Similar with those who are sight impaired and those who are autistic. Three recent examples come to mind that underscore the point that we need to recognize organic and community-based sources of knowledge production. One is the Flint water crisis, an issue that is very close to my heart, coming from Michigan, but also many activists that I work with have been active in that campaign for clean water in Flint. It took a very conscientious young physician, pediatrician actually, who, despite the advice of authorities who questioned her research and her motives, came forward to raise the question that the water in Flint was unsafe. But well before she did that, with all of her credentials and expertise, parents, mothers mostly poor mothers, low-income mothers, were noticing that the water was not right, that the water was toxic, right? But they didn't have credentials. They didn't have an audience that would listen to them. That knowledge was invalidated and ignored. Another very different example is a situation of police violence in the city of Chicago, another issue close to my heart. In the past several years, we've had a Department of Justice report. We've had the United Nations send a delegation to investigate police violence in Chicago. But long before any of those official bodies came, the organic knowledge of the community was that the police were not accountable, that there was a blue code of silence, that much violence and harassment was going on a routine basis. And this, in fact, impeded the ability of the police to have enough trust in the community to even solve street crimes that were going on. So that community knowledge was invalidated because many of the people putting it forward were invalidated as not being expert enough, as not being credible. A third example, another very different example, indigenous people in the question of climate change. Many of us stood in awe at the water protectors at Standing Rock. But indigenous communities for generations have told us the damage we're doing to the climate. Scientists have documented it in extensive reports, but that indigenous knowledge, that organic knowledge, was there even before the reports and the studies were out. And sadly, even with the indigenous knowledge and the scientific community's voice, we still have climate deniers who are putting us all at risk. So to truly democratize education, we have to acknowledge all the places that knowledge is produced and understand with humility that we are only one of those sites. Now let me take a minute to say something about curriculum, about what we teach. And I have a bias here, and this is really resonant of a very rich conversation I had with some faculty at Olympic College earlier today. The arts and humanities are very important in our overall educational system. All the disciplines are important. I happen to be a historian, so I'm biased toward the humanities. But at this particular moment, I feel that we have given the humanities short shrift. That arts and humanities are seen as sort of luxury items in the menu of higher education. And I think this is a very dangerous development. The humanities, in fact, help us map and understand and feel something about our connection to other human beings on the planet and throughout time. As Martha Nussbaum, one of the most eloquent and compelling voices in defense of the humanities, argues, the arts and humanities help to combat narcissism and invoke empathy. And don't we need that? In a polarized world, humanity takes us beyond ourselves. You can think that the problems we have in this country are the center of the universe until you read a Rohinton mystery novel, like A Fine Balance, about the grueling poverty and suffering and resilience of the Indian people. You can believe all the one-dimensional media portraits of sub-Saharan Africa until you sit down with one of Willie Kotsile's books of poetry and a whole different set of images emerge. We know that people have compassion for that which is familiar, and the arts and humanities make the world more known to us. At the same time, they open us up to the power of the unknown. That is, they encourage us to imagine. And we know the famous Einstein quote, "Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited to all we now know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand." In a more concrete sense, we have to ask, what are the implications of scientists with no ethical training or sense of history? What are the implications of a physician with little capacity for empathy for his or her patients? And what about political leaders with diminished capacity for critical thinking, for making rational arguments, or understanding cultural differences? I'm not naming names. When we arrive at a place where the arts and humanities are diminished in public culture and educational institutions, we are vulnerable to mindless demagoguery, to vapid narcissism devoid of empathy. Artists and humanists in every culture, and I mean those inside and perhaps even more so those outside of colleges and universities, are the visionaries, the truth tellers, and sometimes the revolutionaries. They remind us of what it means to be human, to be in community, to be a part of something larger than ourselves, and to have empathy and compassion for those around us. And yes, these are teachable qualities. In Martha Nussbaum's words again, the humanities, quote, give us the ability to think critically, the ability to transcend local loyalties, and approach the world's problems as world citizens. We ignore and devalue the humanities at our own peril. Finally, the challenge facing educators at this moment, and I want to hold up this question, is what kind of institutions do we want to produce? What kind of institutional citizens are we going to be? And what kind of values are we going to embrace? We cannot even approach this question without locating ourselves in time and place, without defining our own historical moment. And sometimes we talk as if we float above history. For example, if we lived in Berlin in 1933, when communists and Jewish professors were being forced out of universities, we would understand that to be a byproduct of Nazism and fascism. If we lived in Chile in the 1970s after the overthrow of Salvador Allende and watched the forced disappearances of thousands of student activists from their campuses and their communities, we would understand that to be a bloody byproduct of Pinochetism. If we lived in South Africa before 1994 and watched the massive student protests that shut down the so-called Bantu education system, we would understand that to be an extension of the system of apartheid. Or for those of you who are paying attention to the struggle of Palestinian students today at Birzeit University outside Ramallah, who are leading the right to education movement, that struggle cannot be understood outside of the confines of the Israeli occupation. As much as we might want to see ourselves in insular terms, we cannot afford that luxury. We are in and of this world, and we are in and of this time. And I would name this crisis as a neoliberal crisis, but I would also, without being alarmist, name this as a proto-fascist crisis. We can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A if you care to. Even if we debate whether we are in a proto-fascist moment or not, we surely see examples of neoliberalism all around us, defined by privatization and the worship at the altar of the market. We see a kind of watering down of liberal arts education and the corporatization of colleges and universities, and even K-12 education with corporate-sponsored charter schools. CEOs serve as university presidents with little educational credentials except business acumen to build cost-efficient institutions. And a new academic lexicon has emerged that increasingly describes us as service providers and our students as customers and clients, as if we were selling trinkets at the local Walmart or tune-ups at the Jiffy Lube. Quick, cheap, and no frills seems to be the ultimate pitch point. So to return here to my point about the moral and ethical challenges that educational institutions face. One thing we cannot afford in this moment is a kind of ethical agnosticism. We cannot pretend that we don't make ethical or moral decisions because we make them every single day or allow them to be made for us. I'm reminded here of the words of three insightful creative thinkers: Toni Morrison, Henry Giroux, and Rod Ferguson. According to Morrison, we should not collaborate in the fiction that universities and colleges do not teach values, that we are neutral. Once we admit that this is the case, we can fight more openly about what those values should be. Morrison writes, "Like it or not, we are paradigms of our own values, advertisements of our own ethics, especially noticeable when we presume to foster ethics-free, value-light education." Giroux adds, "Higher education represents one of the most important sites over which the battle for democracy is being waged." And my colleague Rod Ferguson, in a 212 book, The Reorder of Things, speaks directly to the challenges, obvious and subtle, facing institutions of higher learning in the 21st century. Ferguson writes about, quote, "the ways in which technologies of power begin to work with and through difference in order to manage its insurgent possibilities." Again, we were talking earlier today about different notions of diversity, whether that is transformative or cosmetic. Ferguson writes about the social movements on campuses that created interdisciplinary programs, only to see many of those programs eviscerated in their implementation. Many of our diversity programs are well-intentioned, but we have to ask the question, are they superficial or substantive? Ferguson concludes, "We must retain and elaborate an awareness of the contradictory nature of modes of difference as ways to simultaneously appreciate and evaluate our radical vulnerability and as a means of imagining strategies of intervention to create fissures and make room for the inadmissible." To create fissures and make room for the inadmissible. What's inadmissible? Or perhaps thinking back to access, who is inadmissible? Even though colleges and universities talk about engagement and service learning, it is often inadmissible to embrace models of truly engaged scholarship, or the critical service models that people like Tanya Mitchell writes about, that are reciprocal and accountable to disenfranchised communities. It is often inadmissible to make interventions that bridge the incredible and obscenely unequal gap between tenured faculty and the precarious nature of our adjunct colleagues. It becomes inadmissible to engage the fact that many young people who should be in our classrooms have been corralled into the prison industry. It becomes inadmissible to talk about the reality of undocumented students who are often treated as second-class citizens, denied scholarships, and sometimes even admission to university spaces. These are only a few of the inadmissible questions, the taboo questions that we often tiptoe around in regular discourse. But these are precisely the questions that we must discuss. So how do we make room for the inadmissible? How do we make space for justice? How do we, as conscientious individuals, educators, resist being cogs in the wheels in schemes that undo the values that we believe in? I want to conclude my remarks on a somewhat anticlimactic note, and I want to talk about some of the practical applications of the ideas that I've just talked about. I don't want to be the speaker who comes and talks about all the problems and offers no solutions. So the project that I currently run at University of Illinois at Chicago is called the Social Justice Initiative. And we've tried to tackle this issue of universities, colleges having a corner on the market of knowledge production, and we do that in a number of ways. One way is that we have courses where we have community leaders, community experts, organic intellectuals, if you will, come on campus and co-teach or teach courses, and we pay them. We recognize and validate that knowledge. We also have a program we support called the Prison Neighborhood Arts Program, in which a number of university teachers and artists go into Stateville Prison, which is a maximum security prison in Illinois, to teach courses there and to find ways to bridge the barrier between the large number of Illinois citizens, a large number of citizens throughout this country who are incarcerated. And of course, people know the absolutely obscene figures. We incarcerate more people in this country than any society in human history, disproportionately and majority people of color. Another program we have is the Pipeline to Justice program, which is a scholarship and mentoring program for community organizers who want to come back to college and complete their degrees. And again, it's a way to validate the work they've done, to validate the experiential knowledge that they've acquired, and to assist them in navigating the bureaucracy of the university. And we also raise funds to support them in doing that work. Another program is the Geographies of Justice program. It's a program that's funded by the Mellon Foundation, and we've done it a little bit differently than other universities have. We have had it, the Geographies of Justice, set up as a seminar which involves not only academics from around the world, but also local activists and organizers, some of them trade union leaders, some of them community leaders, some of them faith-based leaders. But we engage in discipline study and debate together from our different locations, our different areas of expertise. And in doing that, we try to really forge a new epistemology, a new way of knowing and learning together as peers. So often we go into communities and we go in, educators with PhDs go in as the experts, as the purveyors of knowledge, but not as people who come to receive knowledge. And so we've tried to flip that script a little bit. And the final program is a consortium that I sit on the board of called Imagining America, and it's a national program that, a national consortium that involves actually 100 schools, four-year colleges, community colleges, and it is to encourage artists and scholars in public life. And a creative set of programs exist: community archives, community-based courses that are offered, and art and design projects that are created in public spaces. And we share best practices across different participating institutions. And that's a program I'm very proud of. One of the signature projects that emerged out of that is a man by the name of Adam Bush in Providence, Rhode Island, who set up something called College Unbound, which is a really innovative small college that is serving the underserved and the excluded from most traditional colleges and universities, including formerly incarcerated folks. So those are projects that, you know, people are coming together to really rethink education, to rethink knowledge production in all kinds of very exciting ways, and in a climate in which many of these programs are at risk of being defunded. So in my own practice as a historian, as a writer, I have been enormously enriched by my experiences in universities, in colleges, on campuses with my colleagues who do the work that I do. But I have to say, you know, some of the learning spaces that have been the most stimulating, the most provocative, and the most enriching have been those spaces that are either on the borders of universities and colleges or completely outside of universities and colleges. And I always treasure that and recognize that, you know, as a part of my intellectual community, my learning environment, et cetera. So I want to close and give us time for Q&A and for discussion about some of the things I've raised and some of the attendant questions embedded in some of my remarks. But I want to close with a quote from Nelson Mandela, which really combines an appreciation for social transformation with a recognition of the importance of education. And Nelson Mandela said, "Education is the most important tool that we can use to change the world." And I indeed believe him. Thank you. So I think we have about 20 minutes or so for questions and comments, disagreements, polite ones. I know there are a lot of activists in the audience also, and that is a big part of my life and work. I'm happy to talk about activist strategies if you'd like. Yes, I think there's a floating mic. Mm-hmm.
Earlier today, I watched a documentary on HBO about the integration at Little Rock, and I started watching it very hopeful, but by the end, I'm not sure if you saw it, it's an HBO special.
I didn't see it.
Rather sad at the current state of the education system there, and I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, I didn't see the documentary, but you know, certainly the Little Rock Central High School was the site of historic fight over desegregation in 1957. It was also a site of contestation and struggle between the federal government and the state government. Orville Faubus, who was the governor at the time, essentially refused to follow federal policy and desegregate. Troops were brought in, and eventually, you know, the federal government prevailed. But I think what's happened not only in Little Rock, and I don't know intimately what's going on there, but certainly happened around the country, is the resegregation of schools and increasing disparity in well-funded public school districts and poorly funded public school districts, which tend to be disproportionately people of color. And then, of course, we see, as we see in many aspects of life, the privatization of public education. I mean, in Chicago, we've had a couple of years ago, we had 50 public schools closed, overwhelmingly in poor Black and Latino neighborhoods, only to see charter schools open up with selective admissions and so forth. So I think the state of public K through 12 education is very, very disturbing. I mean, two groups that I work in tandem with in Chicago are part of various networks that I work with, is Chicago Teachers Union and Teachers for Social Justice. And both have really waged an enormous fight around the privatization of schools, pointing out this whole question of racial disparity that continues to exist. So it is a disturbing reality from the South to the North, but I also see creative new formations of teachers and teachers allied with, teachers organized, educators allied with parents in groups like AROS, the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, fighting to expose the crisis and to find solutions that aren't privatization, that aren't charters, et cetera. So, yeah, it's a disturbing reality, but I also see where people are organizing in all kinds of new ways that make me hopeful as well.
You just mentioned some ways that people are organizing in effective ways. Could you talk to some of the ways that you've observed that are particularly beneficial and helping to change?
In terms of education?
In terms of education and...
Yeah, well, I think that the trade union organizing is important. I think that it's easy sometimes to blame teachers, to say, we have bad teachers, we need to monitor them more, we need to, pay them less, et cetera. So I very much support the organizing work that the AFT and the Chicago Teachers Union in my city are doing. That's one part of it. I think that Teachers for Social Justice is a group of teachers and parents that are forming a very special alliance to look both at curriculum, to hold school boards accountable, to talk about community control of schools, which is an issue that is, we've been talking about for decades. There is a constant presence at the school board meetings in Chicago, at the local school councils in Chicago. So I see that kind of hands-on participation of teachers and parents together as being a critical ingredient at local levels in making a difference, and exploring new forms of curricula and pedagogy, right? The criminalization of young people and the ways in which young people are pushed out of the school system, the overly punitive measures that are taken when any kind of behavioral problems develop in K through 12. I mean, this is what I see some of the more progressive voices resisting, to say that, we don't have the luxury to give up on kids. So, so all that work makes modest inroads, but I see the organizing as critical in opening up new possibilities. But I think we all have to play a role in what happens in education as well, because I think in some ways we've allowed for this sort of stereotype image of certain Black urban and Latino urban youth as super predators, was a term that was used in the 1990s. Today, gangbangers, and there are all kinds of words that get deployed that essentially say we're going to write off these young people. And I think that is a very, very dangerous starting point, and I see many voices resisting that. So I think that has to be resisted at the same time that we look for concrete solutions. Funding of schools is a critical, the K through 12 system, investing in it is what our communities need to do in a much more equitable way.
Hi, Dr. Ransby.
Hi.
So, the world of higher education loves to use the word diversity. Here at Olympic College, we talk about diversity a lot. We have a diversity conference even. And what I noticed at your programs at UIC, you make the strategic choice not to call them the diversity projects, but the social justice projects. And I'm sort of wondering if you can talk about that strategic choice and what you see are some of the differences between these two concepts of diversity and social justice in higher education, please.
Well, thanks for that question. I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier. We actually do have diversity. We have diversity committees at the University of Illinois, and we also had a diversity strategic plan and all of that. But we've also, alongside that, introduced and advanced the idea of social justice. And I always say, we like diversity, right? But diversity doesn't necessarily equal justice. And I think we have to up the ante. We have to say that we are not simply looking for, brown faces in new places, but we are looking for some sort of transformation. And to say that we want to bring people from varied backgrounds and cultures into dominant institutions, but we want them to behave as the way in which everyone else there has always behaved, is not to really say we want even diversity, right? Because diversity means a wealth of experience. It means new ways of thinking and doing things. And if we're not making room for that, we have to ask, what is the process that we're engaged in? I'm committed to social justice, and I often give the example of, slavery, for example, was a diverse institution, right? I mean, plantations and plantation household, people were in close proximity to one another, had very intimate relations with one another. So to look at a plantation community, it was diverse, but it was unjust. I feel that to aspire to embrace the idea of social justice, even as we grapple with what that can mean inside institutions of higher learning, I don't think there's a blueprint for it. To me, that gets us further along the road that I think many of us want to take. So that's. Am I fielding? I don't even see where the mics are. This person had her hand up.
Hi.
Hi.
I am the white mother of a non-white adopted child,
Mm-hmm.
and I got him through high school and some years of college through this sort of sheer, almost white privilege determination on my part, which I would be sort of ashamed of in any other context, because the school district just was not willing to work with him. I didn't realize what a fight it would be. So I've taken a few years off. He's in his late 20s now. And I look and I see that things are really not any better. When I talk to younger parents, they're actually possibly worse than when he was there. So I keep thinking, as a white woman, I'd actually like to get back into it, but I'm not quite sure what I should do or what I could do or where my place is now that my son is grown and has a job and his own home. And so I'm just going to ask you that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we make choices about the role we played. I invoked Ann Braden earlier, who is this, anti-racist white woman who went against everything she was trained to be as a Southern white woman born at the time that she was, and was an anti-racist fighter her entire life. And so I don't think one has to necessarily have a personal connection to a particular form of injustice in order to be a principal voice against it. And I think, in fact, that's the goal. I feel, myself, if I speak out against homophobia, if I speak out against, anti-trans, anti-queer violence as someone who's not queer, I mean, that is really important. I'm not doing it in, speaking the voice of people who are experiencing the brunt of oppression, but my silence says as much as my voice does. And so I'd rather my voice be heard as an ally, as a supporter, and as someone with a vested interest in transformation. So, my view too is even this term allyship, which is important in the sense that it centers self-determination and people speaking on behalf of themselves who are experiencing the brunt of a particular form of injustice. It also, in a sense, underestimates or understates the ways in which all of us are compromised by certain forms of injustice. So even the question of sexuality, let's say, those of us who don't consider ourselves queer, we still live in a society that polices how we express ourselves because we have to constantly display our appropriate gender behavior, right, so that we are not labeled as that other. And similarly, white people are compromised by the realities of white supremacy and racial injustice, although not feeling the brunt of it, but living in a society that has that legacy. So I think you shouldn't have to feel that you're acting simply on behalf of your son, you're acting on behalf of your values. And so, I mean, there's groups here like Surge, standing up for racial justice, and we have a Surge in Chicago that we work with. So there are many organizations that are multiracial organizations and white organizations that are doing important anti-racist work inside and outside of schools. So I hope you will be a part of that work. What's happening? Okay.
Hello. My question is around student support. I've read and seen and also experienced personally that if you're a first generation student to pursue a higher education, or even first generation to pursue a high school diploma, you have great challenges because you don't have the family support that other students who have generations behind them who have attended school. They have just a whole network to help them get through the process. So what programs or insights do you have that institutions can do to fill that gap to make those students equal through their journey?
Yeah, the Chronicle of Higher Education had an article about, I want to say about 7 or 8 months ago, about this very question about first generation college students. I was a first generation college student. Yeah, I mean, I think in the same ways that we deal with the special needs of all categories of students, I think this is one. I think it's very important when we talk about issues of social justice that we also talk about issues of social class, because, and it's not unrelated to race, but it has its own unique dynamics. One of the things that I appreciate about Lonnie Guinier's work that I invoked in my remarks is talking about this notion of meritocracy, which assumes that we all are, coming from, an equal playing ground, equal starting point, and that we advance according to our merit. When in fact, having a certain amount of class privilege, having a background of parents who could tell you how to navigate applying to college, who could help you with your homework, who could introduce you to people who would give you internships. I mean, all of those represent a certain set of privileges, right? And so if we're trying to be democratic institutions, we have to factor in class inequality when people come to college. Now, one way of solving that too is if education were a right and not a privilege, and we could think of all kinds of innovative ways to make people feel included at home, on our campuses, comfortable in different kinds of learning environments. We're not quite there yet, but again, there are organizations on campus that talk about first generation as as a part of a diversity agenda. There is at our campus, in fact. So that's one step, but I think really factoring that into the policies that we develop is really critical.
Okay, I have two. There was a documentary, and it was about American Secret, and it was here in this area that these children, and it's all over, that were adopted from Ethiopia. Okay, a way to get rid of the responsibility is to set them up so that they supposedly break the law, then you no longer have to provide or support them. These kids are out on the street, so they're not going to get an education. Now, as an activist, what can you suggest, or what could be done of some type of activist organization to get them a roof over their head? Because it's really hard to go to school if you don't have a roof over your head or food in your stomach. And then my other thing is, have you ever heard of Concrete Mama? Which has to do with Concrete Mama. This was during the 70s, and it was a couple of guys from the Seattle Times that spent time at Walla Walla State Prison, which was very experimental during that time. And they went there, and there was a lot of different structures and organization, and they're also very involved with the community college to help educate the inmates. But and Warren Buffett's sister donated a lot to financially. How do you go about getting people outside of the system, outside of the government, involved in donating to try to reorganize the prison educational system so people have an ability to learn something that they can use when they get out, so they don't wind up just going back again?
Lots of big questions. I mean, there is a whole, I'm missing a conference this weekend in New York that focuses on education in prison, right? Education in prison, and then educational opportunities, because many formerly incarcerated people are not eligible for scholarships and government loans and so forth. So, to really reduce those barriers, but to also create programs that are supportive and recognize the challenges of people who are formerly incarcerated. The Prison Neighborhood Arts Program that we support in Illinois is one model of that, but there are many all over the country. There's an Inside Out program, which has been controversial in some places, where college students actually go in and have some of their courses in penal facilities alongside inmates, and so who are fellow students, and that's a way of sort of breaking down the barrier. Now, it's a little bit of an artificial way, if you ask me. The first question you asked about how to deal with young people who've been forced out, who are homeless, who really don't have, there's no magical way. We need support for public services. We need homeless shelters. We need affordable housing. We need wraparound services in schools that, help young people when they're confronted with a whole array of problems, economic problems, psychological problems, et cetera. And many times these programs are being defunded. I can only take the microcosm of Chicago to know what some of those details play out like on a local level. And we had a number of, at the same time our schools were closed, street violence is rising. We had a number of mental health facilities that were, community-based mental health facilities that were closed, and the demolition of public housing, and only a small portion of the housing units that were destroyed were actually replaced as affordable housing. And so these kind of, we have to pay attention to those numbers, and we have to pay attention to the human casualties. If you destroy, 10,000 units of public housing and you rebuild 1,000, you have to ask the question, where did those 9,000 other families go, right? They're in very precarious living situations, including children who, are students in our classrooms or not in our classrooms because they're not, not surviving, really. So, when I hear the current administration talk about, dismantling and defunding numerous government agencies, right? It sounds, all this money is going to be saved. Well, what is going to be the cost in human suffering? And I really think we have to ask that question profoundly in asking not just who are we as educators, but who are we as a society? And education is only one part of that.
So let's take one more question.
Okay, yeah, I see we're at 8.
Okay, hello. From your experience as a historian, will you discuss more about what you...
Where are you exactly? Okay, yeah. The light is like right in my face.
Am I using this properly?
Yeah.
Can you refer to, or what you referred to as this time, the present day proto-fascist crisis, and
that would be the last question, right?
Yeah, specifically what has worked from your perspective as a historian in the past? You can help us to see the opportunities, maybe resources in addition to your books.
Well, since November, I've been in many discussions, retreats, long phone meetings with various scholars and activists about how we might define this political moment. And some people feel that following many of the developments in Europe, that this is what we see in this country right now is what they would term right-wing populism. Other people, including former Labor Secretary, Robert Reich, who is not a, radical by most calculations, describe some very disturbing and palpable features of fascist regimes. And fascism, like slavery, like liberal democracy, has a range, right? Exists on a continuum. So Nazi Germany was not Mussolini's Italy, was not Franco's Spain. Fascist regimes have had different characteristics. But the threat of repression and censorship, the attack on semi-independent press with virulence, the questioning of democratic institutions, like the court system, et cetera, I mean, all of these portend to a certain kind of repression, a certain kind of centralization of power and authority, questioning any truth but the truth of the leader, merging personal interests with political power. You know, all these are characteristics of dictatorships and fascist regimes, and we feel like we're in a bubble, you know, like certain things can't happen here, and I'm just not that optimistic. What I am optimistic about is a number of new coalitions out of this sense of urgency have emerged. Young people are talking about what is a united front, meaning what do we do in situations of political urgency to unite with people we might not have lots of agreement with, but we have a strategic interest with. So I feel optimistic about those things. You know, there's a big day of learning and teaching on April 4th, which is the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, and then on May 1st there are going to be demonstrations that will involve immigration rights activists, queer activists, labor unions, and so forth. And certainly the January 21st Women's March was an enormous outpouring of women and men who, many of whom had never been involved in political activity before. So I feel that, I do feel that we are in a serious political crisis, and I feel like we have to talk about it in all kinds of spaces, including this one. But I also see new forms of activism emerging that make me quite hopeful, and so I don't think it's, you know, I don't think it's a fait accompli. And so to say proto-fascism is to say that there are ingredients for increasingly fascist policies to be put in place. But what happens, what the ultimate outcome is up to us. Thank you.